being a working parent and having a spouse that's working at the same time, and then having these kids here. And then, what is that, what's the larger sort of implication for other folks that maybe don't have the luxury of a two-parent household, or someone's working outside of the home, et cetera?
Yeah, there's a lot of dynamics here, and there's a lot in terms of really just what you talked about. Like, there's so much going on. I know for me, I was fortunate in many, many ways. One is not having very, very young kids. For me, I probably get interrupted, I would say maybe every 20 to 30 minutes with a "mommy, look at this," or "mommy, how do I spell that?" or something like that. But I mean, I have colleagues from my co-working space who have very young kids, right? They're kindergarten, they're grade 1. And it's like every 5 minutes, every 3 minutes, right? They really, really haven't been able to do any other work. And of course, given that it was a co-working space, of course, everybody's business owners. So it's like now suddenly that's your livelihood. It's not just, it's not just talk to your boss and be able to get some leniency and maybe adjust deadlines and whatever, which some people are able to have. It's, I'm shutting down my business. And for me in the first wave of the pandemic, that's exactly what was it. And at that point, my business was 7 months old. Like, it's barely established. I was, just starting to plant tiny little roots that were maybe going to go somewhere, right? Like, it takes time to do these things. And then bang, I've been shut down. I shut down, and I had been shut down for almost as long as I've been in business. Wow. Which is not good. So, I mean, the reality is, no. And the reality is for me, having a partner who works full-time for a corporation, who makes a very steady income, who had been at that point at the same organization for 18 years, had moved up the ranks, right? Like, what's the decision? What's the logical thing to do?
Of course. Right.
So that was a big part of it. And of course, we had a co-working space. So we had all these conversations because many of us were in the same boat. So I was shut down until almost September, where I relaunched in late August and starting over again. And then we hit December, and there's all this chatter about, first it was, we are not going to have to extend the holiday break. That would be ridiculous. We see no reason to do that. All the kids are going back on January 4th. And for whatever reason, I don't know why it wasn't anticipated that the holidays would bring about these crazy numbers in COVID, which should have been obvious to everyone, but apparently it wasn't. So fine. So then it was, well, okay, we'll do 1 week of online learning. And then in the first week of the online learning, the week of January 4th, it was on Tuesday, it was a very firm, we're sticking with the 11th, that's how it's going. And then Thursday it was, okay, yeah, we're not doing that anymore. So there's a whole other portion of it too, where you can't plan because it keeps changing. So if you live in Ontario and you have children, you probably know, like, things have been going back in stages. So Northern Ontario did go back on the 11th, and then more boards opened up on the 25th. And then even more opened up over the last couple of weeks. And the last remaining vestiges are those of us in Toronto, Peel, and York.
Like, what about folks, parents who are maybe working outside the home, who are still considered essential workers, or still, their businesses are still open. They maybe have to work those jobs for livelihood. What does it look like in terms of subsidized programs? What does the government, do you have answers to that? Like, what is the government doing to help those folks out, especially if we're looking at populations of folks that are BIPOC and considered minorities? How are we assisting them, if at all?
I mean, it's all over the map. No surprise there. I think one of the biggest challenges our BIPOC fellow folks run into is finding culturally appropriate daycare. And I know for me, I always have to preface this by saying I'm adopted, but my dad's family identifies as Métis. So just so you have the proper context.
That's awesome.
And like, I can just imagine, as far as I know, I don't think any of them have really young kids and worry about that and are dealing with that situation. But you have to imagine, right? What's the legacy of our residential schools And, you know, maybe only a generation out, right? Somebody my age with young kids, their parents easily could have been in residential schools. Of course, the last one didn't close till 1996 in Ontario. So, you know, imagine how comfortable are you going to be leaving your kids with some random white ECE, right? There's a huge component there of, I don't know if this is safe. And then the whole other aspect of language, of culture, of, right? Those are major gaps in the system. One thing I found really interesting early in the pandemic was, I think we were 2 or 3 weeks into all this shutdown stuff, and they figured out that some daycares needed to be open for doctors, for nurses, for grocery store workers, for cleaners, for like all these people who are in these frontline positions. And I remember thinking, like, did it not occur to you that some of those people would need childcare? Like, it just, to me, it was so bizarre that that wasn't a, okay, we're gonna have to shut this down. What might be affected, right? Here's the main thing. Okay, what branches may come off from that? And like, it seems like none of those discussions took place. And now we're seeing, of course, a much higher proportion of women work in these essential roles who are Black, who are Indigenous, who are new Canadians, who are, you know, these populations that we generally don't serve very well. And I don't know, we're not even thinking about kind of the basics. It's really bizarre to me that that gets missed because it just seems so obvious.
Of course. Well, I mean, that I think speaks to a lot of how we also structure our society, right? Like, we realized how essential workers like grocery store workers and cleaners and folks like that were, you know, and had a temporary wave of recognition, albeit from, you know, Galen Weston, et cetera, in terms of pandemic pay, but they've gone straight back to the same pay that they've received previously, and they continue to go in and work and put themselves on the line. And then having children too, potentially, it's a huge thing. You know, if your child gets sick, you can't necessarily take time off to pull them out of daycare. You know, it is a big missed opportunity.
And it's so funny. The second the announcement dropped that school was going to be held online for the first week after January, we have a WhatsApp chat going with the women who use my co-working space, and it was not pretty.
No,
I mean, immediately I was like, how much money do you want to bet that if it was mostly men having to take the time off school or having to take the time off work to help with this homeschool support, how much do you want to bet the schools would magically be the safest place for our kids to be? Like 1,000,000%, right? And it's the same, I think, when you look at some of these discussions happening now around a paid sick leave program, around like better protection for PSWs, better funding around long-term care homes, so that, you know, they don't hire a bunch of people part-time and send them off to 3 or 4 different homes and whatever. We're seeing exactly what the problem is with that. And it's, if it had been men mainly in those roles, would this conversation have come to the forefront, you know, decades ago? Because people in long-term care have been saying to our ministries for the past several administrations, we are underfunded, we don't have enough staff, we don't have enough resources, we can't do our jobs properly, we are overworked, we are burned out. They've been saying it for decades. And it just makes you wonder, right? A lot of those places are staffed by women. They're staffed by people of color. They're staffed by new Canadians. They're like all of these groups that we marginalize in so many ways. And it's like, this is what it takes for it to come out. That's a pretty pathetic statement on work and on society. It's really sad.
I was, I can't recall if I was reading it or I listened to it on a podcast or I consumed something somewhere about how the sort of industrial 40-hour work week is so flawed. I mean, it's flawed for a bunch of different reasons. The industrial complex is done. We're not in this manufacturing sort of era anymore where we have, you know, assembly line, we're all independent, et cetera. But the idea was obviously in an ideal North American sense that, you know, a woman would stay home, rear children, and take care of the house, get dinner ready. And so the man would walk in and the dinner was ready or his cocktail was ready. and all the things we used to see. Yeah, a cocktail at 5 o'clock would be nice, but
I'm in, sign me up.
yeah, exactly. But how flawed that is when women enter the workforce, because now there isn't a dedicated person at home doing all these things. And now you are expected to both have a healthy relationship together, rear your children, bring home equal, if not more money on one side, have a social life, also contend with all the things that we talked about, Zoom burnout, the fact that you're locked indoors, and how it's so unfair, because it's an ideal that was structured upon something that was totally unbalanced to begin with. And how women have really suffered specifically during this pandemic time. And I know that, hearing from previous parents in roles that I've had previously, in this time, it's incredibly tough. Like, how are you supposed to get a meeting done when your kid goes to nap every couple hours? Like, how are you, I blocked off this hour and nobody respects it. Everyone keeps booking me in these meetings, but my kid naps at noon.
Mm-hmm, exactly. I feel like, I know for me in my own situation, it's been extremely challenging there's a lot of projects I've turned down. A lot of things I've been saying, I just don't think I can do that right now, because I don't know how much time I have to commit. And when you take all women and all women who are parents and all people who identify as women, and you've done that en masse, what are the long-term repercussions of that? And nobody knows yet. And I don't know, I feel like a lot of decisions were made without thinking about consequences. Which out of necessity to some extent, but it's like, now you still have to deal with the consequences whether or not you anticipated them. So it'll be interesting to see, I think, going forward, how this plays out in terms of, right now we're seeing the biggest departure of women from the workforce since whatever it is, the 1960s, the 1970s, right? It's the biggest loss of women from the workforce. What are the long-term repercussions of that? Or is that going to recover as the economy recovers? 10 years from now, are we still going to be at, 1980s levels of women in the workforce? It's really hard to know right now.
I did see a statement from someone who was like, I fled Beirut when I was 4. I missed 4 years of school immigrating to Canada. Like, I have a master's degree. Like, you're going to be okay in terms of education, but in terms of the way that we impacted our kids long-term, what is their career going to look like? Mm-hmm. Are they going to have the same opportunities? And have we sort of stifled the generation unwillingly, of course, but, to your point, with consequence that was never really examined, it might have been different had it been a bunch of men who were impacted in the same way that women identifying folks are. Yeah.
A lot of people are feeling nervous about, like, oh my gosh, my kids have lost this time. Oh my gosh, what about this? But in all honesty, I've seen it over and over and over. People go back to school in midlife. People get a master's degree in their 60s. People will adapt to that. It's that social piece of, what does it do to your ability to form long-term quality relationships? What does it do to your ability, whether you're a child or not, to job search effectively, to have confidence in your skills, to be able to market yourself to an employer? Those are questions we don't know the answers to.
And we won't know, unfortunately, for 5+ years.
Yeah.
I know a bunch of teenagers in school right now that are going to be heading into university in a couple of years. And it's like, you want to go into business? What's business going to look like in 2.5, 3 years when we, go back to an MBA program or go back to a commerce program? It's not going to, and how then will our jobs change in terms of evolving our understanding of what the landscape looks like? Especially for you on a high school to university basis, maybe we will leave this, and I talk about this a lot with millennials. I'm a child of baby boomers, so they were very much sent off to university. You have to go get an education. Generation before them didn't get that opportunity. My paternal grandfather left school at grade 8, and then went back and got his, I'm looking at his information right now, but went back and got his Bachelor of Arts, when I was born. He got it in the late 80s when he was in his 60s, because that's what you did. You left and you went, you worked. So when you had the opportunity to go to school, so both my parents went to university, which is incredible. My sister and I both went to university, and I think there was this must be educated. University is the end stop. And I wish that there was more emphasis on what about co-op programs, which I know there's more now, especially in Ontario. Or up in Manitoba, there's one college, it's Red River College, and it has a great co-op program. But like there's a lot more to potentially be there. And I think it'll be interesting to see from your perspective, kids going into maybe more applied learning or experiential learning programs, and then the workforce that we get out of that. Even on my end, with new graduates coming out of school and into the workforce, what their skills might look like and how it'll be different, hopefully evolved from their time in school, time on screen school, to maybe have a different sense of applied learning, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what does that do in terms of their long-term professional development? How do they approach project management in the workforce? How do they approach dealing with clients? How do they, right? It puts a different shade on everything.